Welcome to Canadian Justice. I'm Christine Van Gyn, and today we're talking about the prospect of vaccine passports, a certificate that would allow vaccinated people to travel international without restriction, and they may even be used to allow vaccinated people within certain countries to return to normal life. Vaccine passports have already been rolled out in a few countries. For example, Israel has vaccinated a large part of their population, and vaccinated people are given a green pass that allows them not only to travel, but to do things like go to concerts. But there are many concerns about bringing vaccine passports to Canada. Is this an indirect way of making vaccination mandatory if you need it in order to engage in civil society? And what about individuals who can't be vaccinated for medical reasons or reasons of religion or conscience? And what about privacy? Vaccines can allow us to return to normal life, but would creating vaccine passports mean this normalcy comes at the expense of our fundamental rights? Today, we're going to be digging into these questions. We're joined by Dan Kelly from the Canadian Federation of Independent Business and Alan Richards, a Canadian privacy lawyer. Thanks, both of you, for joining me. Mr. Kelly, I'd like to start with you. I know businesses must see the temptation here. Across Canada, businesses have been ordered shut for months, and I know they're desperate to reopen, and vaccine passports could make that possible. What are you hearing from your members about this issue?
Well, look, I did some media interviews about the prospect of allowing international tourists to come to Canada with a vaccine credential. And my head was ripped off by angry business owners who were just absolutely unhappy with the idea that there would be two sets of rights to come to Canada even for foreign tourists. So it's an incredibly controversial idea. But look, I think there are many business owners that are really desperate right now to be able to reopen, and those that are open to stay open. And so they're looking for any other measure rather than lockdowns to try to be able to maintain some semblance of normalcy. So, for example, a catering company or a wedding photographer, they're absolutely desperate to get open. And I think for some of them, the idea of at least having a credential that would allow some guests to attend an event, to go to the theater, to travel, they would welcome that idea because the alternative is complete closure. But for many others, and including many other employers, they're telling me that the prospect of creating two tiers of Canadians is just something that they do not want to do. And of course, there's a host of administrative issues that come along with it.
Well, I don't envy the position you're in, Mr. Kelly, dealing with these competing interests. Mr. Richards, on vaccine passports, I want to ask you, we have charter rights, we have fundamental freedoms. Do vaccine passports implicate those fundamental rights?
Vaccine passports certainly touch on our charter rights and beyond. They're at the high level, there's charter issues of mobility rights, as well as that of security of the person. Privacy rights are certainly implicated at both the federal and provincial levels, as well as huge issues of equality issues under anti-discrimination legislation and human rights codes. And we would be trading some fairly important rights in exchange for the promise of safety, quite similar to what we saw in the post 9/11 period.
Now, Mr. Kelly, can you comment on the difference between the international vaccine passports versus domestic? In Israel, which I mentioned in my opening, these passports allow people to participate in civil society. And I know a lot of your members, I'm sure, don't like having to enforce all kinds of new government measures. What would having this new measure on top of existing health measures mean for some of those members?
It really does depend on what it would replace. Look, I think if the choice were vaccine passports versus being fully open to serve whomever you'd like, the idea of vaccine passports would be ditched in 2 seconds by any business owner. But if the prospect is full business shutdown, not an ability to serve a single customer, or the ability to serve some customers that are able to demonstrate a credential, or to have staff that are able to demonstrate some form of credential, that then becomes a bit of a different ballgame for many of these firms. Look, where I see this going, the Prime Minister's already thrown a couple buckets of cold water on the idea of vaccine passports for domestic application. But the idea for international travel, I suspect that there's a lot of buzz and activity happening around the world.
Welcome back to Canadian Justice. I'm Christine Van Gyn. Mr. Kelly, I cut you off at the end there, and I just wanted to give you the opportunity to follow up on your point there.
Yeah, look, I think it really does depend on what vaccine passports, what applications we're using them for, domestic or international. Look, when I've traveled internationally, I routinely have to show my yellow fever vaccine or typhoid or other types of vaccines in order to visit a foreign location. So that's well established already. And so I can imagine that becomes a bit of an easier pill to swallow for Canadians to allow American tourists this summer to come to Canada to visit some of our awesome spots. But if there was a domestic application, I think that's when many Canadians, including Canadian business owners, might have some pretty serious concerns.
Now, Mr. Richards, I want to follow up on that comment about yellow fever. You know, this idea isn't completely new. Some countries already require certain proof of vaccines. There hasn't been widespread outrage over the yellow fever vaccine requirement. So why is there outrage over the COVID vaccine passport concept?
I think there's an important distinction to be made between countries recommending vaccines as a condition of entry, but not mandating them, and actually making vaccinations mandatory in order to enter a country. I have people say to me all the time that, when I was a kid, in the 70s, I had to show my, like Dan was saying, vaccination passport for yellow fever or these tropical diseases. And the answer to that now is that human rights law has evolved over the last 40 years. You have the IATA and the WHO have strongly encouraged states over the last 2 decades or so to move away from mandating vaccinations as a condition of entry in order to promote more open and equitable access. And at present, under the WHO's international health regulations, the only vaccination that states can require is the yellow fever shot. And only about 15 countries do make it a requirement. And none of them are exactly paragons of human rights. So to reintroduce the idea of vaccine passports, even at the international level, really cuts against the last 30 years of human rights and seems like a big step backwards.
So, Mr. Kelly, I want to ask you a question about businesses, the impact on businesses of these vaccine passports domestically, not just as service providers, but also as employers. What do you think the impact of a vaccine passport would be as an employer? Would businesses be required to have their employees all be vaccinated if they're going to require a vaccine of their customers?
This is a hot question. We're getting it from a load of business owners right now about whether or not they can insist that their employees are vaccinated. Many of them are just not sure whether they need a vaccine policy in their workplace. They're asked questions from some employees about whether or not they're going to allow unvaccinated people into their business, either customers or staff. As we understand it, there are pathways to allow employers to make it a condition of employment, certainly in new employment contracts, and the possibility exists for existing staff as well, with obviously some duty to accommodate. So we're providing advice right now. We've had a lawyer join.
And by duty to accommodate, you mean like an employee who, for a medical reason, might not be able to be vaccinated. The employer would need to accommodate that employee.
That's right. If there was some reason why the employee couldn't or refused to be vaccinated, there would need to be some potential accommodations in those circumstances. But look, this is a question that we're getting right now in real time. And I'm not sure how this is going to go, but I can tell you it is definitely controversial. Many business owners have also expressed concern about creating 2 tiers of employees in their workplaces as well. So it's by no means a uniform view on the part of small employers for any application, either as an employer welcoming customers within Canada or to be used for an international purpose.
Now, Mr. Richards, we only have about 30 seconds. I wanted to ask you, on our charter rights, what right specifically is implicated? You mentioned there are a bunch of them, but would it be, Section 7, a right? Is this a security of person issue?
It would depend on how the vaccine passports are introduced on a domestic level. It would be a Section 7 issue regarding, say, patient autonomy. Do we have the choice to get the vaccine or not? As well as mobility rights. Say one province imposes a vaccination requirement on out-of-province travelers or people wishing to move to the province for work.
Right, a lot of big impacts here. We're going to get back into this after this commercial break. I think Dan has to leave, but we will continue this conversation. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing vaccine passports. We're joined now by Carrie Bowman, a bioethicist professor at University of Toronto Medical School, and Alan Richards is still here with us. He's a privacy lawyer from Toronto. Now, Mr. Bowman, I want to start with you since you're new to the conversation. I support vaccination. I strongly support voluntary vaccination, but I do not support mandatory vaccination. Is domestic vaccine passports, if it's required to re-enter civil society, is that kind of a backdoor way of making vaccination mandatory?
Well, it's not making it mandatory, but it certainly is a significant push and infringements on people's fundamental rights. I also very much support vaccine, but also people's right to be able to choose with this. And the question is, who would be supporting this? Would it be the provincial government? My guess is that's very unlikely. The federal government, or would it be private enterprise? Would it be restaurants and malls and sports centers? So, what it would do is it would put people's lives that didn't have the vaccine passports would become, as time went on, more and more circumscribed, more and more difficult to move around. And that would be very problematic because, freedom of movement is really, really, part of people's rights. And what it could do, to answer your question quite directly, it really kind of erodes the consent element in which people say, I really don't want a vaccine. I'm really not into it. I don't feel safe with it. But I feel like I have to do this because otherwise, I can never do all these things again. So that would not be a good thing. It really compromises the quality of the consent, as I would say it.
I know, Mr. Richards, I want to ask you the same question. Is this a sort of a backdoor way of making vaccination mandatory in Canada?
Well, I agree as well regarding vaccinations. And actually, just last week, I took my 90-year-old grandfather to get his first shot.
Amazing.
But we have to be cautious of the inevitable temptation of government to directly or indirectly make these vaccinations mandatory. And the government could impose sort of a de facto mandate by saying, well, we're not going to make it mandatory, but if you don't get it, you're going to be frozen out entirely from civil society. And historically, courts have not looked too kindly on governments trying to do an end run and slide a policy objective in through the back door like that.
Yeah, I certainly have concerns about creating two classes of citizens. Now, Mr. Bowman, I have another question for you. I'm going to be honest here. I'm not confident in the government's ability to pull this off as a practical matter. On the ground, how would this work? We know electronic health records have been a mess, and healthcare is a provincial responsibility. How would a system like this even work?
I'm imagining, that's the best I can do. The only way I can imagine it, and everything I've read and followed, it would need to be electronic. So it would need to be something where, you're entering whatever, whether it's a mall or a gym or something, you would actually show an app on your phone. But do we have those apps? We don't. Are people being vaccinated now? They are. They're left with a piece of paper. So, we're nowhere near organized enough to even do this. So you would need to show that. But boy, is there an element of discrimination to that. And, people can interpret things in different ways. The other thing is there's an element of surveillance to that as well. Like you go out on a Friday night for whatever, it's your own business, what you do, dinner, a drink, a coffee, there'd be an element of surveillance. And there would be some part of medical information on that, which, as I see it, would not be well protected. It's not in a hospital chart. It would be your vaccine, certainly your date of birth, maybe a few other factors. So you got freedom of movement, you've got surveillance, you've got confidentiality and privacy. So there's a lot of reasons why this is very problematic.
So, Mr. Richards, what's your view on that as a privacy expert? What are your privacy concerns here?
So, of the many aspects of privacy law, I don't think it's a stretch to say that medical privacy is the type of information requiring the most stringent protections. Health information is the most intensely personal type of data, and it's correctly kept between patient and doctor. And in many ways, this topic has been litigated decades earlier, where activists correctly fought the notion that the sick or those perceived as sick are second-class citizens unfit for full participation in society unless they can prove proof of positive health, which is what gave rise to a lot of our anti-discrimination provisions as well as provisions in our human rights codes.
Yeah, certainly really, really concerning. We're going to continue this conversation after this commercial break. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're talking about the idea of vaccine passports. And Mr. Richards, I want to follow up on that question with you about privacy. I mean, who is going to be developing this technology? I've read different reports of private sector businesses that could be developing this. And we hear all the time about hacks of information. And what are the risks to privacy you see here with that approach?
Right. So regarding data privacy on the government front, we have to ask, how will our information be safeguarded? Who will have access to it at the provincial and federal level, and even internationally? How will it be shared with different countries? Will the information that's collected suffer from that sort of mission creep that we saw in the post 9/11 era with national security databases? And then perhaps the bigger concern is when it comes to the private sector. Some of these passports that are being developed by, I think the last ones I saw were Microsoft and Salesforce are developing their own. So privacy legislation imposes fairly strict standards on how health information is handled and who can handle it. So for example, Ticketmaster or MLSE or Loblaws up to that challenge? Do they want to be? If they're checking our health information to get access to a sporting event or a concert, or even just to do our grocery shopping. And what about mom and pop shops where they don't have those same resources to dedicate to privacy safeguards?
Really a complicated question. So, Mr. Bowman, I want to ask you, what are some reasonable alternatives to this? We all want to return to normal. How do we get there without a policy like this?
The short answer is I'm not sure. But one thing I'm watching very carefully, and I do not have a clear picture, and I've spoken to a lot of intelligent people, and they don't either. What's the timeline here? So I'm speaking now of Canadian society. The vaccines are rolling in. Are we going to be able to well and truly distribute them quickly? What's the window where even the consideration of a vaccine passport would have to be reviewed? I don't know. Are we talking 6 weeks, 6 months? We don't know. The other is it could be a colossal waste going to happen. Decides that they're going to, organize all of this. So I don't know what the alternative would be. The counter to the argument, Christine, is if in fact people, and we don't know this yet from a scientific point of view, but assuming people are not infectious, and again, I repeat, we don't know that, assuming people are non-infectious, the other side of the argument, is it really fair to limit the rights and freedoms of individuals that have followed these rules for a year plus, when in fact they're of no danger to anyone else? That's the counter argument that you see. I mean, I think the alternative is we do a really good job with vaccines and the whole society moves forward together. I think that's what our goal needs to be.
And Mr. Richards, what do you view as an alternative to this policy?
Well, I think an underappreciated aspect of the passport debate is that we are rapidly approaching the tail end of the pandemic. You have seasonality. The vaccine rollouts are continuing, increasing herd immunity. It raises the question of, if private companies and government are spending millions of dollars to develop and maintain these vaccination passports, will they be willing to do that for 6 weeks, 8 weeks? Or is it going to be one of those things where it's like going to the airport now, where 20 years later, we're still taking our shoes off?
Yeah.
That's security. So given where given where we're at with the pandemic right now, it's almost becoming a moot point.
Absolutely. Well, it's
Yeah,
an
I
interesting
agree.
policy question, and I want to thank you both for joining me. We've heard today about the debate around vaccine passports. Now, I support vaccination. I believe vaccines are safe and they're our best hope to return to normal life. When my age group is eligible, I'll get myself vaccinated. But that's my choice. Other people may make a different choice, and some people, for medical reasons or otherwise, may not be able to make that choice at all. Should those people be denied the right to participate in society? In my view, no. And vaccine passports would be an unconstitutional and unethical punishment of people who are making the best choices about their own health. But what do you think? Are vaccine passports coming to Canada? Are they necessary in order to return to normal life? Or are they an unjustified intrusion into our individual health choices and fundamentally discriminatory? You be the judge. I'm Christine Van Gyn, and remember, a freer Canada starts with you.